Well, we want to move here to another issue that is critical from the point of view of civil liberties, so connecting to issues, and also here in the United States, and that is the ongoing authorization of government surveillance on Americans. And they say it's on people in other countries, but nonetheless, the reauthorization of Section 702 of the FISA Act. And we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show here by Kevin Gosztola, who's the managing editor of shadowproof.com, the curator of the dissenter.org newsletter, and the co-host, I wonder who his other host is, of the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure.
It's me, guys. I'm the other host of that show.
Kevin, welcome back.
Somebody else named Rania.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. As always, I really appreciate it. And maybe just to frame the conversation, some people probably saw the sort of flurry of news articles that came out in the beginning of the week that there's a push to reauthorize Section 702. But what is Section 702?
Yeah, so this is a section of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act that we all learned a whole lot about thanks to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden and the many documents that he disclosed. And when we're talking about 702, we're talking about programs like the upstream surveillance program, which basically means that the agencies of our government or the intelligence agencies of our government would have the ability to get the communications from the internet backbone. So these are like the fiber optics cables that run and connect us all around the world. And then there's the downstream surveillance. And the downstream surveillance is what people might know as the PRISM program. I don't know if they call it that anymore, but when Edward Snowden exposed it, this was the way in which the NSA could get communications from, let's say, Facebook or Google or Yahoo or companies of that nature. So when we're talking about this, we're basically describing how the FBI or any other agency that wanted to use the database of communications can basically put in a selector, and they can go through and do a search, and they're able to use this communications for basically any purpose. Yes, they do have to go before the court and put in a request. But there's also a way in which they can do something called backdoor searches. And backdoor searches allow them to just search the already existing information that's been collected in this database without going to get a warrant for that information. So this is we're talking about a tool that is available to the U.S. surveillance state that we know has been abused, that we know has only been modestly reformed. It's been heavily documented. Even the very agencies or institutions that do the little oversight over this process have shown that there's constantly mistakes. I'll put those in quotes. I don't know if they're really mistakes, but usually you see that the agents who are involved don't understand this. They're going too far. They're using this information in ways that are improper, but there's really no push until someone is targeted inappropriately to do anything about it.
And of course, now that you have the reauthorization coming up, is there any official pushback? We have this group in Congress called the Squad. I'm not saying this to be ooh, let's go after them. I actually don't know. And that's why I'm asking you. Is anyone in the Progressive Caucus pushing back against this? I know there's also some people on the right in Congress who've tried to fashion themselves as being, very libertarian. So I assume there might be a couple of members of Congress in the libertarian camp who are hopefully against this. So yeah, what do we as American citizens have to look forward to in terms of anybody out there in a position of power protecting us from this sort of spying?
Well, as far as Congress goes, it's worth noting that there was a Republican congressperson, his last name's LaHood, who's from Illinois, who wound up being the target of an inappropriate search in this. But what's fascinating is he says that he would still like to see Section 702 or this authority reauthorized. So it solidifies, he's a Republican, it solidifies my belief that these Republicans who oppose mass surveillance simply just don't think they should ever be the victim or the target. But everyone else can be targets of our surveillance apparatus, and that would be okay for them going forward. I don't know how much we're going to see from progressives, certainly with Biden and the White House coming out in support of reauthorizing Section 702. I think we're going to be very fortunate if we even see a little bit of tinkering with it that takes care of some of the issues. We saw a statement come out from Jake Sullivan, of all people. He's the national. He's frequently involved in national security affairs for the Biden White House when he's not plotting to start World War III or
blowing up pipelines,
engaged in helping to facilitate the censorship industrial complex on our social media. He says that they need this in particular because it helps them fight the war in Ukraine. It helps them counter China. It helps them challenge North Korea, Iran. They say that they need this tool in order to fight cyber attacks, to deal with ransomware threats. So that's why the Attorney General, that's why the person who is in the position that James Clapper used to hold, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, that's why they believe that we have to continue this. And with those institutions saying that they want this authority to continue, with it being that Biden is in office, we have a Democrat. We don't usually see progressives challenge a Democratic president. There really wasn't any challenge when it came to these excesses under Obama. I don't think without Edward Snowden we would have ever seen any kind of push to deal with the mass surveillance that was exposed. And so I don't think it looks very good. I mean, I don't treat the Republicans as good faith actors when they challenge what the government is doing with surveillance, but they probably will be the most vocal opponents of reauthorizing 702, which will mean that there will be a lot of pressure from progressives and people, I think, on the left to say, well, I don't really trust you. And they're not probably going to join in the struggle to prevent this reauthorization.
Yeah, no, it's interesting and very much a tinge of the election over the Republican response here. I know Ron Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, has tried to put this on, but yeah, it seems like a lot of tinkering, and I mean, and that to some degree feels important to me, Kevin. In looking at this, is that they might try. It feels like each time this comes up now, they try to say, well, we've added some new guardrail, and then it turns out that whatever that was also did not work. It's been going on and on and on and on, and I think people don't even fully understand the nature of this process. I mean, there is this sort of FISA court, but I think when most people think of court, they think like, oh, they have a lawyer, I have a lawyer, but there's no adversarial process whatsoever. I mean, there are many negative things and hypocrisies around the sort of quote unquote American democracy, but I think sometimes it really kind of flies under the radar how this is just squarely outside of what I think most people's sort of popular conception of a democratic process would be, despite the claims.
Yeah, it's important for people to understand that as far as oversight, we really don't have much of anything that prevents the FBI and these other agencies from abusing the surveillance authority that has been given to them. And anytime groups try, there just was a Supreme Court decision. They refused to hear the ACLU's case that was brought on behalf of Wikimedia Foundation, which was an effort to challenge this very thing that we are discussing on this show right now. And they said basically the government can invoke the state secrets privilege and they're not allowed to challenge the way in which this surveillance is carried out against people. And in that, there were organizations that represent journalists. There's been a case before that has represented human rights advocates, but in this case, people were raising the chilling effect on journalism because this could target your sources. This can be a means, especially if you engage in international journalism or you're a foreign correspondent, they can go after your sources and collect those communications because they have this very broad term. They say they want to collect foreign intelligence information or any information about foreign affairs. And if what you're doing falls into that category, then they can intercept it. So hypothetically, anything that you were doing on a foreign government, or you could target entrepreneurs. So people who do business in China could be targeted. People who want to do business with, I guess, trade partners that are not cooperating with U.S. capitalism, those individuals, they could find themselves on the wrong side of the equation, being targets. And so I think this is a really troubling thing because we do not have a mechanism for making sure that this isn't abused. And the one last project that I'll mention is when Ron Wyden was questioning the FBI director, Christopher Wray, this past week, we learned that there was a pilot project earlier where they were purchasing people's data, that the FBI had actually gone to like a data broker and purchased data that could facilitate their investigations. He said it was a pilot project. But what's baffling to me is even though they're not adopting this thing to get around getting a warrant by going out to purchase data, they've experimented. And the Congress has no idea what kind of experiments are happening within our government agencies. We're far away from the culture that we had about 50 years ago when the Church Committee exposed what the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and all these other agencies were doing to expose domestic surveillance of anti-war and left-wing activists, etc. And we just don't have people in Congress who believe that there are those in these agencies who are going to just consistently abuse their power and flout what is authorized. And I think some of that has to do with the topsy-turvy nature of our politics. Ever since Donald Trump, Democrats have internalized this idea that they need to stand up for the FBI and the CIA and the Director of National Intelligence and all these other security agencies against Trump and Republicans and others who attack the integrity of people who work in these institutions. And while this isn't part of our conversation, that was on display today in the Twitter Files hearing where Matt Taibbi was testifying about the censorship industrial complex. You have Democrats who are making it a part of their identity to defend censorship of people, whether it be on the left or the right. And I think that that truly makes it impossible to do oversight of our security state.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a good point. And I'm trying to remember who this was. I think it was like Dick Durbin many years ago was saying how the information on the Iraq war, how he was like doubting it at the time, but because he was a member of the Intelligence Committee and he had sworn to keep it secret, which you of course have to do, he just like did not come out and say it. I wish I could remember the whole context of the story, but it does really just show how it feels that something has been, just carved out, as it were, for the national security state, since they set it up in 1947, the sort of Cold War nature of it, where this official enemies kind of policy, and I think this is sort of what you're speaking to with Trump and how it all played out, is really the thing that is backing this, that because there are all these sinister enemies that are out there, we have to do little carve-outs in our democracy, which I think makes these pressure campaigns around Russia, around China, around whoever, particularly dangerous, not just because of wars abroad, but because of how it turns inward.
Yeah. Look, we're almost at the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, and I have flashbacks to the way in which President George W. Bush or Dick Cheney would have talked about threats and the way that they justified the expansion of surveillance when it came to the war on terrorism. And so now we've lost the paradigm. We're no longer in the global war on terrorism paradigm. The paradigm now is that we have to counter Russia, or we have to counter Iran or China, these great powers, or you're hearing about cyber threats, or you have something that I think I might actually share a bit of commonality with people who are on the right wing for just a fleeting moment, not too long. Don't get too confident in yourselves, right-wing libertarians, but just the idea that we need government agencies to help us understand what is factually incorrect or factually correct, to sift through information, to police the data stream that is coming across our feeds on social media, and to manage threats to our country by basically determining what is acceptable discourse, what we can share about foreign policy or about domestic affairs. And I think it's truly troubling that we've seen everything develop into this basically, you're seeing that these programs find a way of rehabilitating themselves or finding new purposes as they lose earlier purposes, right? So you can't really get people afraid of Al-Qaeda anymore because Osama bin Laden doesn't exist and these figureheads are gone. We don't hear about an ISIS threat. But they can repurpose these programs and find other reasons why they have to be reauthorized. So this ritual where they reauthorize the FISA Amendments Act provision every few years actually renews the support for it to continue. I mean, on one hand, you could say, quit doing this if you're going to keep reauthorizing it. But I think this is a ritual that makes people have to show their devotion to the security state and prove that they still believe that it can function. And so that's why we see it keep happening again. And the last thing I'll close with here is to say that people should know the history of the FISA Amendments Act comes out of a response to the exposure of warrantless wiretapping by President George W. Bush. And you might remember that President Barack Obama said he was going to challenge and fight this and he wasn't going to vote for it. And then he abruptly voted for the FISA Amendments Act and then went on to be one of the worst presidents when it came to civil liberties and human rights. And I think the history of this country, just continuing the Bush program wholesale.
Shadowproof.com, thedissenter.org, the podcast Unauthorized Disclosure, all places you can find Kevin Gosztola and all sorts of great content from him and others. Kevin, as always, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.